Welcome to you all. I am Dr. Lindsay Fallon, and I am on the executive committee of Division 16 of the American Psychological Association. And we have the absolute pleasure of sharing some wonderful content with you this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, around the topic of supervision specific to school psychology, the developmental ecological problem solving, or the DEP model, by our esteemed presenters, Dr. Mark Swerdlick and Dr. Dennis Simon, and I will allow them to introduce themselves in just a moment. But as we are admitting everyone into the Zoom room, again, we ask that you just stay muted since we're doing a traditional Zoom webinar, or we're using a traditional Zoom format for this webinar because there are breakout room activities and opportunities for engagement. A traditional webinar format wouldn't work for that. So we are doing a good old-fashioned Zoom, and we are hoping that in order for us to be able to accommodate such a large group in this format, that everyone is able to remain muted until there's an opportunity for discussion or sharing that would require coming off mute. My role is to be in the background to help problem solve anything that is coming your way with regard to tech or anything else you might require in the next 2 hours. I will also be monitoring and engaging the chat. So I will be posing questions to you. I'll first start by asking everyone if they wouldn't mind introducing themselves in the chat if they're up for it. We'd love to see where you're joining us from and what your role is in that setting. And finally, we are recording this session, so hopefully that is okay with all, and we will be having it available as a home study continuing education option for future parties interested in this topic. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our presenters, Dr. Swerdlick and Dr. Simon, and I will be here if you need me. So welcome, everyone.
Dennis?
You go ahead first, Mark.
I think you're I think you're first.
We're pleased to have everybody join us today, particularly pleased at the wonderful mix of practitioners, field practitioners, and university supervisors. I think that will lead to rich discussion in our workout rooms and very practical applications for the DEP approach to supervision. We'll take a moment to introduce ourselves. I'm Dennis Simon. I'm a licensed school and clinical psychologist for over 4 decades now. Experience of supervising interns, professionals, and psychological service programs. For the last 14 years of my regular career, I was the director of a zero reject public therapeutic day school in the Chicago metropolitan area. My work has really focused on program development and psychological interventions for children and adolescents experiencing social, emotional, and behavior disorders, and the application of evidence-based strategies to school-centered interventions. After I retired from the school district, I spent a good deal of time at Loyola University of Chicago teaching both intervention and supervision classes. And so I'm very pleased to be with you today. Mark?
Yeah, let me add my welcome, either good morning or good afternoon, depending what time zone you're in. I'm Mark Swerdlick, a former program coordinator and faculty member in the school psychology program at Illinois State University. I recently retired as a full-time faculty member, but that's been a little challenging. So I continue to teach the supervision sequence in our doctoral program, and I'm very pleased my colleagues allow me to continue to do that. I really enjoy that. like I say, let me add my welcome, but also my thanks to Dr. Fallon, who kind of coordinated this webinar and has agreed to kind of monitor our chats and handle the breakout room. So we appreciate it. So welcome to everyone, and we look forward to working with you this afternoon. Dennis? Oh, I'm sorry. We did want to just recognize a couple of colleagues who also contributed to this presentation. Dr. Tracy Cruz, who's at Western Illinois University, and Dr. Danny Newman, who's at the University of Cincinnati. Dennis?
So why do we need continuing education on supervision? Actually, one of the questions might be, why do we need professional development and supervision period, since it's not even technically required at the specialist levels program? So I think that will soon change. The fields of applied psychology recognize and are now regulating training and supervision. It's not adequate to assume that good practitioners make good supervisors, just as not all good athletes make good coaches. Supervision is now considered a core professional competency. And similar to other competencies, it's not like we learn it and don't continue to evolve in terms of our understanding of best practices, but we need to consult with colleagues, continue to engage in study and in professional development to keep our competencies up to date. It's a core skill defined by both APA and NASP, but it's one of the most neglected areas of knowledge in school psychology. Supervision in pre-professional training and early career support provides the foundation for quality services within the profession. More than 75% of school psychologists become supervisors, many after 3 years of practice, and only 10% receive formal training. Many approach supervision in reaction to the supervisory experiences they've had, kind of like what we do with when we think of parenting our kids, keeping the good and vowing not to create the bad in terms of our own supervisory experiences. Slide, please. The DEP model is a supervision model tailored to school psychology, and its principal innovation, we believe, is highlighting the importance of ecological interventions, considerations for both intervention and supervision. Historically, the literature on supervision has focused on clinical and counseling psychology. It was originally tied to different models of psychotherapy. There was psychodynamic supervision, CBT supervision, client-centered supervision. Limited attention in all of this early practice of supervision to context and systemic concerns, which are of particular importance in school psychology. And it certainly wasn't designed for teaming, it was designed for one-on-one therapeutic relationships. The unique, diverse roles of school psychologies and the breadth of our domains require a specialty-specific supervision. Nobody has the breadth of different domains of professional practice as school psychologists do. So we developed the DEP model specific to the need to address that scope of practice in school psychology. And it's important to have theory to drive our practices and to specifically address service provision in schools. Slide, please. So we're going to set the tone a little bit by giving each of you a chance to reflect on your personal supervisor and supervisee experiences. Slide, please. So what have been your best supervision experiences? Reflect on that. What do you value, find helpful? What was your worst experience? What do you wish was different or could have been changed? And the larger question is, what would be ideal? What characteristics would you like a supervisor to have? So let's take 7 minutes. Dr. Fallon will put you into breakout rooms and reflect with your partner on these questions to kind of set the tone for the rest of our presentation. So part of the idea of having intentionality in terms of supervision, similar to other parts of our practices, having self-awareness of what contributes to our perception of supervision, and hopefully that discussion got you thinking through what your own histories are that may influence your practice, both from a supervisor and a supervisee perspective. Both supervisors and supervisees bring their histories to the supervisor relationship. And we would suggest that at the beginning of a supervisor relationship, it's good for them to share with each other what their experiences have been. It's similar to discussing previous psychotherapy experiences with clients and finding out what they liked and what they didn't find useful. A direct conversation between supervisor and supervisee can aid in developing a strong, open supervisor relationship from the outset, rather than carrying on more covert expectations. I'll turn it back over to Mark now. We have a lot of content, and some of it will skim over, but leave for you in terms of the PowerPoint that we've shared. Mark?
Thanks, Dennis. Before we consider best practices in supervision, we wanted to have kind of a common understanding of the definition, the roles and responsibilities of supervisors and supervisees. So let's take a look at our definition of clinical supervision. It's just a bit different than others you might find more in the clinical and counseling literature because it can occur at any stage of one's career. So just real quickly, focusing supervision, it's a structured professional relationship between a more experienced, competent, credentialed professional and the supervisee. And it could either be at the pre-service level that I know many of our participants are at, or early career practice, or a more veteran supervisees engaged in a new area or practice, or focused on continued professional development. So it's very consistent with the NAS position statement on supervision in school psych, which says that it can occur at all levels of practice, at all stages of the career: student, intern, early career, or expert. You might wonder a little bit about what supervision might look like for veteran school psychologists. Well, the first one is incorporating new practice initiatives. I know it's true for Dennis and I, and kind of glancing, we won't embarrass anyone by identifying the older members of the group, but I know for many of us, when MTSS, or multi-tiered system of support, became an initiative, many of us had to get more supervision or mentoring because we had to learn more about curriculum-based measurement, universal screeners, had to learn more about core instruction, tier 1. So certainly for veteran school psychologists, when there's new practice initiatives. Also, when we're applying contemporary evidence-based assessment and intervention strategies, we may need some supervision, or what you'll see NAS calls post-career mentoring. Also, and probably one of the most important, is when working in a new setting or with a new target population. I know we have a number of school-based practitioners as participants. Maybe you worked at the high school level and all of a sudden your supervisor or administrator said you're being transferred to the preschool level. And so you may need some additional mentoring around new assessment, new intervention approaches. So that's another example how veteran school psychologists may need supervision, or what NAS calls postgraduate mentorship. And then also, and it's rare, but if remedial support should be needed, if somebody's a veteran school psychologist, but some problems with professional competency are identified, either in terms of professional skills or perhaps even dispositional issues, it may result in being assigned a mentor or another supervisor. These are kind of the goals of supervision. Foremost, as many of us, I think, recognize.
Good job.
Where many of us kind of realize a major goal is to ensure client welfare. That's our ultimate responsibility. So in terms of the cases we choose or activities we choose for our supervisee, we want to be sure that we're considering client welfare. Certainly, the most common goal is increasing the supervisee skills. For those of us participants who are in pre-service, either in terms of on-campus training, or many of you, I'm sure, are internship supervisors, then gatekeeping becomes a goal, determining whether this person has the dispositions and the professional skills for entry-level practice. Also, we as supervisors want to give supervision away. We want to empower our supervisees for self-supervision, to know when they need to seek supervision, when they need to go to the literature, when they need to do continuing professional development. So we want to empower our supervisees for self-supervision. And as I just mentioned, a supervision goal could be restorative or remedial support. For example, if problems in professional competency may emerge. There's two types of supervision, both administrative and clinical. When we talk about administrative supervision, that really focuses more on the organizational aspects of school psychology practice. It focuses on personnel issues. For instance, as part of supervision, you may need to monitor the timelines to meet legal requirements for conducting individual evaluations for special education. The thing about administrative supervision is it can be conducted by non-school psychologists. And in fact, the most recent NAS survey found that over half of school psychologists receive their administrative supervision from non-school psychologists. So this could be a director of special ed who's trained as a teacher of children with disabilities, has no training at all in special ed or in school psychology. But what we find from our surveys is these individuals are also conducting the performance evaluations, which include decisions relating to tenure and merit increases. So our position is we like administrative supervision to also be conducted by people who are trained in school psychology, but the reality is that isn't where the field is at. The second type of supervision focuses on clinical supervision, and this is discipline specific, and that means only school psychologists can really provide clinical supervision. They have to be trained as a school psychologist, and the focus is really on the professional practices. So my guess is, as many intern supervisors, you're certainly supervising at the on-campus level, we're doing clinical supervision, and my guess is also some administrative supervision. In terms of recent surveys, less than half of school psychologists, these are credentialed school psychologists, are receiving any kind of systematic professional support, supervision, or mentoring through their school district programs. And then this is really concerning, because we all can benefit in the reasons we talked about in the slide about veteran school psychologists for some type of professional support. supervision or mentoring. And certainly at the early career level, there was a study conducted in 2014 that raised some additional concerns that this professional support and supervision is really critical because nearly 30% of early career professionals felt pressure to practice outside of their area of competence. And our assumption here is if they were receiving some type of supervision, some type of mentoring, they could have worked that through with their mentor or supervisor. So really clinical supervision, less than half of school psychologists are getting any kind of clinical supervision once they become credentialed. These are some of the comparisons between pre-graduate, which would be on-campus training and internship, versus postgraduate mentorship. So one is the idea of vicarious liability and supervision. Sure, many of you know if you're an intern supervisor or practicum supervisor, you have vicarious liability, meaning you have responsibility for everything that happens in those cases. You have to sign off on all reports and official documents. Once the person is credentialed and is getting mentorship or supervision as a credentialed school psychologist, the mentor does not assume any responsibility or liability. So that's one difference. The second difference has to do with evaluative responsibility. In supervision at the pre-service level, evaluation is a requirement for the graduate program or the field site. In postgraduate mentorship, the mentor doesn't hold evaluative authority over the mentee, and formal evaluation is not required. NASP also requires an average of at least 2 hours per full-time week of field-based supervision, but for postgraduate mentorship, they recommend an average of 1 hour a week. And in terms of how that is delivered for supervision, they must receive individual face-to-face supervision, although there are allowances after COVID for some telesupervision. But in postgraduate mentorship, they say it could either be in a group or through virtual technologies. So those are some of the differences between supervision, pre-service versus postgraduate supervision. I wanted to talk a little bit about building an effective supervisory relationship. And this is really critical, as I'm sure all of you know, that really the basis of the foundation of all effective supervision is a strong supervisory relationship. The literature proves that out almost consistently. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, based on that literature, what leads to effective supervisory relationship. And it's really an integration of three things. One is our personal attributes as a supervisor. It also relates to our professional skills, level of professional skills, and then also our ability to implement effective supervisory process. So let me give you a few examples. When we talk about our personal attributes, we're talking about attributes such as strong interpersonal and communication skills, that we're able to be empathetic, but still, although we're empathetic, we can provide constructive and honest feedback to our supervisees, that we communicate that we're motivated and committed to training. In other words, nobody assigned this to us at the last minute, and we really didn't want to do supervision, because that's critical, that we're committed to training, we have multicultural competency, and that we demonstrate to our supervisee we have a commitment and a focus on meeting the needs of our client. So there are others, but those are some examples of personal attributes. As far as professional skills, just like as a consultant, we can know everything about consultation process, but if we have no experience and no knowledge and skills, it's hard to be an effective consultant. And the same is true for supervision. So professional skills are important. Do we possess strong clinical skills? Do we have sufficient experience? Are we effective problem solvers? Do we have the ability to integrate theory and research into our practice? Can we perceive complexity, but are also able to suggest or promote concrete plans of action? And then process skills refers to that we're flexible and available. And it's interesting, availability comes up consistently high on qualities. In other words, we're available to our supervisees. Also setting high but realistic goals, that we're able to delegate responsibility and trust our supervisee to engage in the struggle of problem solving. And then other factors, which we're going to talk more about in this webinar, is establishing ground rules for supervision through contracting, record keeping, providing effective feedback, and that both we as the supervisor and the supervisee are prepared for supervision. And again, we'll be discussing this in the presentation. We're hoping, I know we haven't taken time for a large group discussion because of the size, but our assumption based on other groups, smaller groups that Dennis and I have worked with, that a lot of these characteristics came up when you were talking about best and worst experiences in supervision. So Dennis, toss it over to you.
So I'm going to give a brief overview and orientation to the developmental ecological problem solving, what's the mouthful, DEP supervision model. Slide, please. Mark, slide, please.
Sorry.
So as noted earlier, there really was a need for a school psychology specific model for all levels of training for clinical supervision and for school psychology delivery programs, which have taken on a significant systemic focus in addition to the traditional individual work that we've done. So the DEP model defines the key elements of effective supervisor relationships, some of which Mark just delineated, but also we will talk about the required structures that help to make those supervisor relationships effective. The DEP model is not merely a theoretical model, though we believe it is theoretically sound and mirrors the research and best practice, but it's a practical model which for each component, we will be defining behavioral markers that indicate the implementation integrity of the application of DEP to supervision and specific activities that supervisors can engage in to be effective. Slide, please. So we're talking about a thoughtful, purposeful, not a seat of the pants approach to supervision. And when we talk about supervising interns and practicum students, we're talking about the critical role of linking theory, research, and practice at that developmental stage of entry into a profession. It's important to have a framework for doing that. And the supervisory model needs to provide an organizational framework that guides practice and ensures that it is purposeful. Slide, please. This is a graphic of the DEP approach. And as you see the dynamic arrows that are both within each of the triads and around, it underlines the point that these three components really need to be integrated components. We'll talk about them separately, but then we'll give a case example showing how they are integrated. So the developmental, the ecological, and the problem solving, and hopefully the arrows give a sense of how dynamic the supervision process is within this framework. Slide, please. So as you can see in this part of the triad, the developmental, from left to right across all three domains: supervisory development, supervisory functioning, supervisory role. There's a movement from less apt functioning to more structured, independent functioning. And there's a developmental curve for supervisory development, supervisory functioning, and then a developmental curve in terms of our role as supervisors in terms of how we engage in practice. Slide, please. So let's look at the developmental component in more depth. The key points are in red. And this significant structuring by the supervisor, particularly at the outset of the internship. There's a lot of anxiety that supervisees have as they begin a relationship. And Mark will talk later about the use of a supervision contract to address some of that anxiety and structure supervision. But that is part of the developmental component and our belief that structure prepares the supervisee for a successful supervision experience. Initially, there's dependence on the supervisor, and the goal, though, is to have phased progression toward eventual independent functioning. And like all parts of psychology where assessment, intervention, and progress monitoring is really the hallmark of what we do, no matter what the task is we do as we perform as school psychologists. The assessment of entry skills and training needs and goal setting is critical for purposeful supervision and for subsequent progress monitoring. And the assessment of skill levels is something that needs to be repeated throughout the training cycle. And we need to recognize that there will be differential abilities on various required skills. So we take the 10 NAS domain, someone may be functioning even as an intern at a reasonably competent level in some, but be quite at the novice level in terms of others. Slide, please. I noted that there are, so routine formative feedback is a core piece of what we do as supervisors. And multi-method supervision is essential for a developmental process, so that different stages of development require different levels of support and guidance. We do much more demonstration, direct instruction and modeling, and much more intense oversight and earlier points in the supervision cycle, and then gradually begin to phase out to do more coaching and consultation and enable someone to grow professionally into independent practice. The eventual developmental goal also is to begin to prepare the supervisee for the eventual practice of supervision, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Slide, please. So the behavioral markers, how do we know that we are executing the requirements of the developmental component? By providing sufficient structure, and after this overview and case example, Mark will talk about some of those structures. Developmental assessment that occurs repeatedly throughout the training cycle. The central task of feedback and evaluation, and the use of multi-method supervision. Way too much supervision is based solely on self-report, and we will talk at more length about feedback and multi-method supervision, but they are key behavioral markers for the developmental component. And then eventually meta-supervision of the supervisee's supervisory practice. Slide, please. So multi-method supervision is embedded in the developmental component. Slide, please. The developmental progression is from frequent modeling and direct observation to possibly some direct practice on some skills, and then some co-intervention and co-consultation or co-assessment with supervisor and supervisee working together, eventually moving to less intense supervision methods, to more consultation and coaching formats that will model hopefully the mentoring that interns and practicum students will get later on in their careers. It's important that we not move prematurely to indirect supervision. I know my experience was often having outstandingly competently trained interns who fairly quickly were accepted by the faculty and parents and students as competent young professionals. But we do a disservice if we just turn them loose at that point and don't continue to provide frequent, direct, and more intrusive methods of supervision, because we have a responsibility to maximize their growth. And if they indeed are showing those competencies at early age of their professional development, they may have potential for significant leadership in the field. Slide, please. So we can think of choosing techniques on a continuum of I do. So I'm showing you, let's do this together. We do, and then you do. You do it on your own. I observe, and then gradually we start working on additional skills. It's important that we specify early in the supervisory relationship, and this is in the supervision contract, that there will be multiple methods of supervision and what the rationale for that is, so that supervisees don't think, oh my gosh, she wants to observe me, I must be doing something wrong. We want them to know that this is a core strategy for giving supervisory input to hone their clinical skills. It's also necessary to account for the comfort, risk, and danger zones that we may have, either as a supervisor or supervisee. Some content may present extra vulnerability for either one of us or the client. Some issues might strike close to home, or challenge our personal worldview. For example, for some supervisees, it might be beliefs about sexual orientation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, in quick summary, here are the methods of supervision. If we had more time, we could go into greater detail about each one of them. For instance, there are ways to make supervisees self-report more effective. I think our main message here is that we cannot, at any stage of the training cycle, rely solely on supervisee self-report. The advantage of supervisee self-report is that helps them to define needs and make sure they're getting their questions answered. Obviously, there are risks for bias, and particularly in early stages of field-based training, they may not necessarily know which questions to ask. Then moving down in levels of intensity, modeling and demonstration, role-playing is a strategy that is, I think, significantly underused in terms of preparing our supervisees for their practice. And sometimes it takes direct instruction. As you'll see in the case example that we'll review shortly, co-therapy and case consultation is another method that assists supervisees by combining modeling, ensuring the welfare of the client, and yet still giving an opportunity for the supervisee to engage in practice. Live observation and recording. There is no substitution from a supervisory standpoint for frequent observations. We have a difficult time in school districts, I think, doing the arrangements for video or audio recording because of the permissions involved. but it is critical to engage in live observation frequently. Finally, coaching and consultation. So less directive, more informal. At this point, usually if it's an internship, it's toward the last quarter of the internship, where we're asking questions, we're raising possible solutions, being less didactic as supervisors. This is appropriate for areas of strength and also for certified professionals who are trying out new skills. Slide, please. The strategic selection of methods is then followed by deliberate practice. So assess skills, identify goals, this outline. An example would be working with a intern who is experiencing resistance from a teacher to consultation suggested new methods of either behavior management or curriculum. I think one of the frustrations often that field students have is what I learned in graduate school in this best practice isn't happening exactly like that in the district. And so a deliberate practice goal might be teaching somebody how to use motivational interviewing strategies for countering that resistance and finding ways to break through to get greater openness to consultation suggestions. Next slide, please. The second component, which I think is probably the most innovative of the DEP approach, is the ecological component. You can see in systemic context how all those arrows really circle and influence each other. There are reciprocal influences within each one of these domains. Next slide, please. It's simply impossible to understand individual students, classrooms, school communities without understanding their interaction with larger environments. Diversity and multicultural practice skills are really essential for professional practice and a growing concern in terms of how we teach cultural humility to our students and how we make that come alive in field training. Sometimes the ecological component assumes that sometimes changing the system is the central component of intervention planning. And this is where social justice advocacy, anti-racist activities come in, and they are addressed within the ecological program component of DEP. The application of the skill of cultural humility is important here. Teaching supervisees how to enable our clients, no matter who they may be, students, faculty, parents, to teach us by telling us their stories. Next slide, please. So the list of behavioral markers in the DEP model for the ecological component are lengthy because while everyone identifies the importance of themes like diversity and multicultural responsiveness, few identify specific activities to implement training in this area. Thus, we'll provide a long list of activities, and at the end, we will leave you some slides that we will merely exhibit, which will give you additional supervision activities to build upon. It's important, the first marker, to establish that as a supervisory goal from the very beginning of the relationship. It needs to be overt, and it needs to be continued throughout the supervisory relationship. One starting point is to orient the supervisee to school and community cultures, to representative ethnic cultures that are present in the school community. Slide, please. It is important for the supervisor and supervisee to discuss their own cultural backgrounds and, critically, what the potential implications are for psychological practice. There are strengths and there are limitations that we bring based on our own identities, cultural backgrounds, developmental experiences that will impact both the supervisor relationship and what happens with clients. We will give you an exercise later that we have found useful for doing that in the early stages of supervision. It's important to discuss the influence of socioeconomic factors. If a large portion of our interns and practicum students come from middle-class backgrounds, they may have less of a perspective or less sense of the. I have a pop-up coming on my screen right in the middle of the presentation. Next slide, Mark. Let me see if I can get rid of this. All right, Google Drive wants me to sign in the middle of the webinar. So it's important that diversity and multicultural issues are carried throughout the year and focused on in all practice activities. So it's not merely a checkbox, okay, in August or September, we talked about diversity and cultural issues, but it needs to be incorporated into all activities. And part of that is, excuse me, part of that is that we have a responsibility as supervisors to give feedback if there is any blind spots, personal biases, or limited cultural perspective that impact our supervisees' work. Sometimes it could be unintentional microaggressions, other times it could be naivete or inadequate assumptions. Next slide, please. So 10 to 15%, we don't really have accurate data, of the students we work with in schools will be LGBTQ students. So it is critical within the ecological component that all supervisees have some experience in working with this minoritized population and how to give adequate supports, particularly during critical adolescent periods. It's also a behavioral marker to give training opportunities in universal intervention. So this is the development of a systemic focus and multi-tier system support in school psychology. It's important that we give those opportunities for program development in those areas to our supervisees. Next slide. So it's a systemic approach. And we want to, systemic approach means you've got to be able to work with parents and you got to be able to do classroom behavior management consultation. Again, why basing a supervision model on one-to-one psychotherapy is too limiting for us. Many of our interns and practicum students are younger than the parents that they will be providing services to, and that often creates lots of anxiety as they become involved in assessment and intervention planning. And so it's critical that we give sufficient opportunities for guided supervision in problem-solving parent conferences and in behavior management. Next slide, please. If we are system change agents, then we need to purposely teach program development and system change skills. Now, if we look at this in terms of an internship year, it's hard to do that effectively, particularly in the first half of the year. And however, if we enlarge our scope of supervision to move into early career, where our early career psychologists are often asked to be involved in program development right from the beginning of their careers, it underlines the importance of specific skills training in those areas. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to give lots of particulars, but it's not something to just to be left by the side if it's considered now a key practitioner role for school psychologists. behavior marker of addressing, defining community resources, how to collaborate with various kinds of social agencies and mental health agencies in the community. And finally here, to teach and employ a case conceptualization model. So our goal as supervisors is not to be answer people to tell our supervisees what to do in every situation, but to systematically teach an empirically supported case conceptualization model that they will then be able to take with them, and in the later stages of the supervision of the training cycle, apply to their cases and take with them into their early career practice. The key thing is from an ecological standpoint, is the case conceptualization model has to address both individual and contextual variables simultaneously. So interventions are for the individual student, but they may also be for parent or classroom or the school district. Slide, please. So how do we develop diversity and multicultural responsiveness in our supervisees? This could be a whole separate webinar and maybe should be in the future. Just the sheer scope of diversity and range of diversity is illustrated in this slide. Next slide, please. I will not go into great detail for the next series of slides, but we want to leave you with the handouts, and those of you who signed up late, maybe didn't get handouts, we can get them to you. The next slides talk about ways to concretely facilitate addressing diversity issues in supervision. From a supervisee standpoint, they need to have a safe space, and also they need a safe space that is capable of handling frank discussions about all the tensions and polarities and experiences that we are currently experiencing in our culture, from the implications of Black Lives Matter to the rise of repression of freedoms, to the whole experience of COVID-19. A key role that supervisees demand from the supervisees is they be exposed to culturally adapted evidence-based interventions. Next slide, please. Then from a supervisor standpoint, we have to be willing to share to monitor our own personal biases and to provide frequent feedback regarding potential blind spots in our supervisees. And topics like racism, oppression, and discrimination must come up in the supervisor relationship. And as we are on a lifelong, professional-long quest to master cultural humility, we need to share our own experiences of dealing with that and how we have become more attuned to racial and cultural biases that can impact our work. The key is to always think systemically. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight the last point here when we talk about cultural differences. So in different cultures have different perspectives, authority roles, gender roles, views of education, attitudes toward emotional expression, different possibilities for boys as opposed to girls in terms of going to college. It's important that all these be addressed in supervision, and we'll leave the rest of this slide as activities for you to consider. Next slide, please. Discussing the cultural influence of parenting styles and expectations for typical roles of fathers and mothers. Understanding the status of acculturation of immigrant families. I know in my experience, often there was a clash between where the student was in acculturation in immigrant families from where the parents were. And there are acculturation scales that exist that can help with that. But it's also critical to address how diversity impacts supervisor relationships. And if there are racial or significant cultural differences, even age differences or sexual orientation differences between supervisor and supervisees, those can't be left as elephants in the room. They should be put on the table and seeing if there are worthwhile exchanges of information and dialogue that would help cement trust in the supervisor relationship. Next slide, please. Note of caution. So there's a whole list of activities, some of which I just leave for your future reference, but it's important for us to note the uniqueness of each circumstance and avoid stereotyping based on cultural identification. We need to keep an awareness that there's more commonality than differences in the human condition. But the differences may be central to case conceptualization and how we adapt evidence-based treatment. So there are exercises for self-awareness, both with supervisee and supervisee, and for us to understand how our personal beliefs filter through problem solving. Now I'll turn it over to Mark in terms of the third DEP component, the P, problem solving.
Yeah, this is the last component of the DEP model, and it's called the problem solving component. And if you think about it, it's what we all do as school psychologists, right? We're data-based, data-oriented problem solvers. So we think about this particular component, we need to be sure we're incorporating into our supervision as we talk about case conceptualization and determining interventions and strategies to work with our clients and families, that we're linking our assessment to intervention, that, like Dennis has been emphasizing, we address both individual and contextual factors, that we're using empirically supported research-based intervention strategies. As part of being good data-based problem solvers, we're monitoring our outcome, and we revise, make decisions relating to revision, continuation, going to other interventions based on those outcomes, and also foster reasonable innovation. In other words, it's usually when we're working in the schools, we can implement many evidence-based interventions exactly the way perhaps they've been implemented in the lab. And so we have to have reasonable innovation changes to that. It also, this particular problem solving occurs when we're addressing intervention planning in supervision and really all aspects of the case. And it's important that we're looking at a way of teaching case conceptualization for our intern supervisors out there. I'm sure many of your interns come based on their on-campus training with an approach to case conceptualization. And it's important to discuss how that's similar or different than yours. How much do you want your supervisee to adopt your particular case conceptualization, but they really need to leave their internship with a strategy relating to case conceptualization. And of course, the goal is the supervisee becoming independent in problem solving as they deal with both individual and systemic issues. So essentially, when we look at the behavioral markers, they're very similar to what we just used in describing this component. Linking assessment to intervention, the issue of applying a case conceptualization model. So if you tape a supervision session, or you look at a transcript of it, or you analyze it, you should see these markers or characteristics. So you're applying, your supervisee is applying a systematic case conceptualization model that includes addressing ecological factors, and you're also targeting both individual and contextual and systemic variables. Oops. You also want to link assessment to intervention to progress monitoring. That's a key aspect of database decision making. I'm sorry. We want to consistently use evidence-based strategies. That's a behavioral marker. Of course, we don't always, but we need to monitor the fidelity of implementation. We can't really judge if an intervention is effective or not unless we have some evidence that it was implemented with fidelity or how it was attended. This third one here is what Phil Kender calls flexibility within fidelity, this idea of revising based on the needs of the particular setting, and of course, collecting routine progress monitoring data and gauging the effectiveness and decision makings regarding continuing, ending, or revising based on that progress monitoring data. We should also involve our supervisee across multiple levels of service delivery, so tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And we also need to, in supervision, apply problem-solving protocols to more indirect service delivery, which would be mental health, behavioral, or instructional consultation. The ecological, if we focus on the middle circle, the ecological and problem-solving components of the DEP model include all of these aspects, anti-racism, being culturally responsive, diversity responsive, and wanted to just talk about social justice advocacy during supervision and consistent with our DEP supervision model. We need to help our supervisees develop skills relating to social justice advocacy. I think we all know this is should have been all along, but is a more contemporary role that's being emphasized for the school psychologists. So it's cueing our supervisees in and talking about practical strategies to eliminate over-identification of minorities enrolled in special ed. These are just some example. Overrepresentation in minorities who are suspended or expelled, limited representation in gifted classes, and other system-level structures and practices that contribute to these. We all know we can't do these changes alone, but we should be part of the conversation regarding them. I will point out there's an excellent text, some of you may be aware of it. It was just published by Guilford Press by Charles Barrett called Social Justice in the Schools, a Framework for Equity in Education, published again by Guilford. It's very practical. It's written not just for school psychologists, but all members of the education community. And if you are interested in different ways of addressing social justice advocacy, I'd really encourage you to take a look at this particular book. Very practical, very applied. I'm going to turn it over now to Dennis to do a case example where he will pull it all together.
And I just saw that someone was asking about that resource, and we can email it out after. Someone also asked about case conceptualization models in the DEP text. We do provide a case conceptualization model that we believe is empirically supported, and at greater length it's also discussed in the school-centered intervention text that I wrote sometime back for Division 16, which is listed in the resource bibliography at the end of this presentation. So here is we're back to the integration of developmental, ecological, and problem solving. So it mirrors best practice in assessment intervention process. So there's a parallel going on with the supervisee in terms of developmental, ecological, and problem solving factors. And when we're engaging in best practice for intervention, we're doing the same thing. We're looking at the developmental status of our clients. We're understanding the systemic context in which they live their lives. And then we are applying best practices in terms of intervention based on that. So let's move on. Next, just jump to the 2 slides, Mark, to the case study.
Hold on.
So for those of you who did not, we asked that you read the case study in advance, given time. Since some of you may not have, just a very quick synopsis. School provided a universal suicide prevention program, and a student, Pauline, realized that her concerns for her depressed friend Mary may fit the kind of concerns that the presenter was talking about. And she approached a member of the psychology staff who happened to be an intern, and expressed a concern of self-harm for her friend. And then the intern was successful in getting Pauline to bring her friend Mary in, but the intern, Sally, was only in her 2nd month of internship and had never done a suicide assessment. So the supervisor preps her to do a suicide assessment, joins in as a co-therapist, and defines issues systemically in terms of stressors for relating to parents, peers, and academics. And she modeled achieving consent for getting the parents involved, directing her and guiding her in the application of evidence-based strategies. And so with that quick summary in mind, let's look at the concrete application of each component. So the contract, which Mark will talk in some detail in a moment, specified that for risk of harm situations, the supervisee needed to immediately report to a supervisor. The intern's developmental status was assessed by the supervisor to decide that for the welfare of the client, it was important for her to get involved in terms of co-therapy and co-intervention, and that she also needed to directly teach her supervisee a evidence-based approach for doing a suicide assessment and evaluating next steps. So the supervisor is involved in balancing training goals and child welfare. In this case example, as you'll recall, all of the methods on the screen were used. So in one simple example, all 5 of those were used. There was direct feedback throughout, and of course, appropriate documentation of professional risk management. Slide, please. So from an ecological component perspective, just the fact that this came out of a universal tier 1 presentation, in this case, is consistent with that. The depression that the student was experiencing was examined in the context of multiple systems. So in terms of peers, she had just broke up with her boyfriend. The girlfriend reached out to the school psychologist, and there's experimentation with alcohol in the peer context. Family, there's conflict with parents that needs to be addressed, and the academics struggling with grades and work completion. Sessions will later include the peer and then later parents. So the interventions eventually will target individual skills and support specific academic supports, but also working with family. So from an ecological standpoint, the case illustrates the importance of addressing individual and systemic concerns simultaneously. Next slide, please. And I think the problem-solving component is the one that we're all most versed in. And you can just take a look at the key elements in this slide, and the use of co-therapy, risk assessment that's directly linked to an intervention plan, and the key is that both individual and systemic strategies were addressed. note in that example that throughout the supervisory process, the supervisor asks the intern to process their collaboration and the effectiveness of the supervisory process. Next slide, please. So frequently, we as supervisors need to seek reciprocal feedback and ensure that the supervisee is feeling that their needs are met also. And that provides an opportunity to explore even further questions. Next slide. So we have lots of material yet to cover, but we wanted to take a moment to see what kind of questions may have surfaced, and relying on Dr. Lindsay Fallon here to raise at least a couple of them for us to consider at this point.
Yes, so in the interest of time and efficiency, if you wouldn't mind sharing your questions in the chat, I can read them to the presenters. Thank you so much for that reference, Mark, to Dr. Barrett's book. It's excellent, and we have a link to it in the chat. Yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to include them.
Of our next section, we're moving into some of the structures that we hope, with samples that we've provided you, will give you some things you could actually use. You know, when I was doing workshops for NAS, we always said presenters have to give you something you could use on Monday morning. And I know what we've covered so far gives you all the background, but hopefully we're getting into some of the things you can also really use.
Why don't
Yeah.
we jump into that then, Mark, and then allow some time a little bit further on in terms of as people put in chat some questions for Lindsay to evaluate.
Yeah, Lindsay, if you see anything, don't hesitate to interrupt us. These are all structures and organizations we're going to talk about now. And we feel it relates to engaging or reflects best practices as a supervisor, and it also decreases your risk and liability. We believe there's a negative correlation between, as you increase the use of these structures and organization that we're going to support training that we're going to talk about, the risk of your liability increases. One of the things we've made reference to is the contract. If we had more time, we would do a poll or something, but our assumption is all of your supervisees, certainly on internship, have contracts that include how much money, how many days they get off, those kinds of things. But this is really a clinical supervision contract, and it relates back to the DEP model and is a behavioral marker, because we know at the beginning of a supervisory relationship, more structure is provided. And we feel because this contract focuses on the responsibilities of both the supervisor and the supervisee, that it provides that training. So these are some of the rationale for having it. It's a clear blueprint of what's going to occur. It's also very helpful because you could talk about things like, well, your reports will be due a week after your final session, and you could talk about it, but if you actually have it in a written clinical supervision contract, you can go back to it. And so it's helpful for that. That's just one example. Also, we've suggested there's we should normalize. There's typically higher level of anxiety early in the relationship, and we feel to provide this structure, being clear about the supervisee's responsibilities and your responsibilities, that helps reduce the anxiety. Again, they learn specifically what to expect. You will also put in there that it's your responsibility to provide formative and summative evaluation, not just quarterly when the university requires it, like for an internship, and that this you normalize it. This is what your supervisee should expect, and that it's how we all learn. Also, you have vicarious liability. Also putting in there things like you don't expect the supervisee to know everything. Again, many may approach supervision thinking if I ask a lot of questions, it's some kind of deficiency in me. And you try to normalize that in the beginning and say, that's how we learn. That's what I expect. In fact, that's a hallmark of an effective supervisee, that they ask questions and you don't expect them to know everything. You have a response, the supervisee has a responsibility to inform you of risk of harm situation, and they must immediately disclose that to you, but you also have the responsibility of providing a colleague backup. We don't always do that if we're not available. Also, the sacredness of the hour. Are you going to put up a sign outside your door in supervision, only disturb if an emergency, but you communicate that to the supervisee, and that also to normalize it and let them know that it's fine if they need additional supervision, but it's their responsibility to let you know that you are not a mind reader, and if they're confused about something, they need to let you know, and you welcome the opportunity to provide more supervision time. So these are some of the things that are in the contract. And then you also include a brief description of the supervision model, and you also let the supervisee know in the contract you recognize you're going to have different developmental levels at different skills. Supervisees in internship may come to you with stronger assessment skills than counseling skills, or vice versa. And so you let them know in the contract that's okay, and you're taking that into consideration. I know we went over this a bit quickly, but I want to remind you, you do have a sample internship contract. Dennis sent that in the email to all of you. It is in Microsoft Word, which means you could change it any way you want, and we really encourage you to do that. We include a sample practicum contract in the text, but you could really revise the internship contract to reflect practicum. And if anybody wants more feedback or more examples, don't hesitate to email Dennis or I. These are just some other advantages of these structures and organizations. So I'll kind of let you read that on your own. But there are 4 organizational approaches and documents that we suggest: an intern supervision contract, or session planner, I should say, client activity notes, what they fill out they're going to do in their next session with their client, and a summary progress note. Also, you should have progress notes as well. So we're going to talk about 2 of these, and we have 2 samples for you. So the first one is the supervision session planner. The literature suggests that the more a supervisee plans for supervision, the more likely they're going to get something out of it. So we do best practice, we suggest it's part of the developmental component that your supervisee fills out a session planner. So this is for them to fill out. They put anything that they want to follow up from the last one. Maybe you gave them feedback on something they did with a client and they want to talk more about it. They also very briefly, not in detail, but talk about what they've done since the last supervision session, how they spent their time. They specifically list what kind of cases or activities they want to review. These are high priorities for them. You may have some too, but this is a document where they're thinking ahead of time. What do I want to be sure I include? Even coming up with some questions, concerns, and feedback they would like from the supervisor. Now, they're not restricted to these things, these questions or issues, they can talk about it in the session, come up with others. But again, it gets them to think about it ahead of time. And then finally, something that isn't completed every time, but we want to help our supervisees develop self-assessment skills of their professional skills. And so periodically you'd ask them to indicate their strengths and their areas of need. So again, this is filled out by the supervisee. We also, as part of best practice, we should also, as supervisors, be providing notes. In other words, for accountability. Also, frankly, it's hard to remember what we covered in the last session. And so having something like this can be very helpful. So the content summary are the kinds of things that we want to follow up from last session, any particular cases, maybe we observed something and we want to provide feedback on that. But this is where, based on what occurred in our last supervision session, we want to follow up on and we plan to do in the future. Also a process summary. In other words, was the supervisee particularly anxious or confident? Also, what strategies we applied in the session. Did we watch a videotape or listen to an audio tape with our supervisee? So we would include that as well as a note from the supervision session. What kind of feedback or recommendations did we give? For instance, maybe we suggested our supervisee read a best practices chapter. Well, if we don't remember that, you can be sure when we make recommendations, it may in fact not be followed through on because we don't follow through. We don't ask for that. If we ask our supervisee to review a certain assessment, we want to be sure in the next supervision session that we ask about that. So that's the feedback and recommendation. And then next steps, what did we give them for homework? What did we give them to practice? And then also for us, even if we don't fill it out every time, we want to write something on the progress we've observed, what kind of goals for improvement, what kind of formative feedback. This proves very helpful. I found it very helpful in writing letters of recommendation because we can go back and really see their growth. So typically some supervisors will use Google Docs and ask the supervisee to put their session planner in the Google Doc, and then you put in your notes, or they may run something off back to back. You also have an example of this, and you really have two. You have a completed supervision note, just like you'll have a completed session planner, so you can see what one looks like, but also as the session planner in MS Word, in Microsoft Word, you also have supervision notes if you want to change it in any way. So really, to make this more applied for yourself, we really encourage you to look at both the example in your handout, but also look at it in MS Word so that you can change it any way you want. And this is just an example of a mentorship agreement. In other words, a contract for what NAS calls a postgraduate professional support. How you're going to communicate, how do you handle canceled meetings? Will you make them up or not? What are some goals and progress monitoring strategies for your mentorship? And what kind of boundaries and limitations of professional support? In other words, as a mentor, are you on call whenever they have a question or issue, or are you going to kind of restrict it to your meeting? So this is kind of the equivalent of what a practicum or internship agreement would be, but much briefer, as you might expect. So that's the section on structure and goals. Again, we didn't do the client session planner where the supervisee may indicate what they're going to do with their clients in the next session, or progress notes, but encourage you to consider these. Okay, And Lindsay, I'll count on you if there's any questions related to this, just to yell them out. Okay, evaluation and feedback, it's obviously a critical aspect. It's also part of the developmental component of the DEP model. And as we mentioned, it's the most anxiety-provoking aspect for the supervisee. And frankly, for many of us as supervisors, let's be honest, sometimes particularly it's easy to give positive feedback, but if it's more critical feedback areas, I like to use the term areas of improvement, depending if they could be dispositional or personality related, we may have some anxiety giving that feedback. Whoops. There's both formative and summative evaluation. I think most of you are familiar with this. Really, we have a responsibility as supervisors to give ongoing feedback. I put in our contracts, and it's in the sample one, a supervisee should never be surprised by their summative evaluation. If at the end, it should be something I've given you formative feedback on, and that we've talked about ways to address it. So again, you'll see when you look at the contract, this is addressed in that. It's critical. These are just some of the importance of formative feedback. And I put in my contract, and it's in the sample, that I have a responsibility to give you formative feedback, but it's also your responsibility to request it if you need more. And so I've had some supervisees say to me, I appreciate the feedback, but can you give me more? You said this went well, but how can I improve it? And so they have that responsibility, as does you. We were going to do a breakout session, but I don't know. I'm looking at our time. I'm wondering if this is something we, I see Lindsay nodding her head as our
I think, Mark, why don't we make this just take a moment for people to reflect on it.
Yeah.
Given our time constraint.
Yeah. A time you received positive feedback, and what was it about the communication or relationship that helped you accept or reject it, and negative feedback, or what was it about the communication or relationship that helped you accept or reject that feedback.
And as you're reflecting on this, know that this is an exercise you could do in your first couple sessions with your supervisee at the beginning of the year, to get an idea from them of what their experience is getting feedback, and what landmines there might be, and also what supports there might be.
Yeah, and really all these breakout session are what are labeled supervisor reflection activities, and Dennis is going to give you more of them. They're also in the handout that you have. So these are some of the issues appropriate for supervision, and one of them is the supervisory relationship. That should be something that's processed as part of supervision. That's really important, as well as these others. So in the contract, it talks about that issues that are going to be addressed and they'll get feedback on are their professional skills, but that also includes dispositions, behavioral indicators as well relating to professional practice. And again, for transparency, and also to let them know that's part of your responsibility, so that they could know what's going well and what areas of growth need to occur. These are the characteristics of effective supervision, or effective feedback, as you might expect, using more behavioral terms, it being more direct and specific is important. So not that, while you're being unreliable, or teachers aren't don't like your approach in consultation. It's more specific behaviors. That it's timely, the more it can, just like behavioral management strategies, the closer it could be to the behavior that occurred, the more effective it is. So if you're giving feedback after an observation, you want to do it as close to that observation as possible. Offered in a calm and respectful manner, sensitive and empathetic, balancing in terms of strengths and weaknesses, or like I tend to avoid weakness and talk about areas for growth. And again, focusing on the behavior, not the person. Obviously, it's easier to receive when it matches their self-perception. That's why, if you recall, and I went over quickly, but in the session planner, it asks periodically for them to evaluate their strengths and areas for growth. You want to encourage that because you want to help them develop their self-assessment of their skills, those skills or abilities related to that. So, and of course, the feedback is easier to receive if they agree with it. I think most of our experiences, our supervisees tend to be harder on themselves in terms of areas of weakness than we tend to be, because they often don't consider the developmental aspects of that. It's best accepted in a trusting relationship. As we mentioned, a strong supervisory relationship is the foundation of all effective supervision. You want to give time for reflection and questions, so you don't want it with 2 minutes left in the supervision session to give them feedback. You want to allow enough time. And whenever you give areas of growth, you should also, best practice is give alternatives for improvement. So it seemed like there were some challenges with building rapport with this child. We're going to do some role playing in the next session to address it, or we're going to give you more practice with this. So that's an important aspect of effective feedback. Most of us, and many of us, use what's called the sandwich method of feedback. We give a strength, we then give a weakness, then we give a strength, and then we give a weakness. And often supervisees say, I should say, we give our strengths and then we give the weaknesses. Typically, supervisees report they always, after the strength, all they're waiting for is for the shoe to drop, for, okay, you're saying these strengths, I'm waiting to hear where my weaknesses are. So we'd like to suggest this 4-step approach. I'm going to add a 5th step, but a 4-step approach. So first you ask the supervisee what was positive about their performance, what they did well. Then you either concur with it and give areas of agreement and elaborate on the positives. Again, they usually don't give many positives. They go right to their weaknesses. That's why a structured approach is helpful. So first they say what's positive, then you give areas of agreement and elaborate on the positive. Then you ask them what could be altered or improved, what areas of growth are reflected in your performance, and then you indicate what could be improved and make recommendations with, again, strategies to address them. The 5th one that I add is, what did you hear me say in terms of your strengths and your areas of improvement? Because often our supervisees leave and they only hear the weaknesses. So if I ask them, what did you hear me say? What kind of feedback did you hear me give you about strengths and areas to improve? And they only give me the areas to improve. It gives me an opportunity as the supervisor to elaborate on those strengths again. So again, it's not part of Cotillion and Sargent's approach, but I asked this 5th stage, what did you hear me say in terms of your strengths and weaknesses? And it's amazing how many, when I asked that, just talk about the weakness. Maybe that's your strength as well, or your experience as well. These are some written feedback. You can take a look at this. If there are concerns, nothing exists unless it's written down, and that's why those supervisor notes are so important. Professional competency concerns, this can be a whole webinar in itself. This is when there are problems. It is infrequent. It's often very stressful and time consuming for the supervisor. But in terms of addressing these, we want to make sure our supervisee is aware of all areas of evaluation. We want to make sure that formative feedback is documented. Again, they should not be surprised if we're identifying professional competency concerns. They should have been informed of these. You need to develop a specific action plan. Some call it a remediation plan. I like to call it a critical skills development plan. So there's different names for it. In the literature, you'll typically see remediation. And then early communication for our internship supervisors in the group. Early communication with the university training program is very helpful rather than waiting until these blow up into much bigger issues, because often the university educators will have suggestions. Maybe there are new issues, maybe there are things that came up before. We were going to do this one again. I'm looking at our time. I apologize. I'm thinking this again might be one. I will say, as you're glancing at this case, the main goal here is to put where the supervisor is hearing that the teachers don't like their interpersonal style and that they're rubbing the staff the wrong way, that you need to find out and give this feedback to your supervisee in behavioral terms. And also, I think in this case, we were hoping it would come out in the breakout rooms, but that you would do role playing with your supervisee, where you would be the teacher, you would be the supervisee, and they would be the teacher, and you would use some of the things you've heard. So that would be an effective supervisory method here. So you have this one, and we have a couple others. If you wanted to use this, maybe you want to talk to some other supervisors about some of these. We weren't going to go over those. Okay,
Mark, I'm wondering if you want to give a tour of this section, given our time frame. A lot of what we have left is meant to be takeaways, but I'm not sure we will have time to go in full detail related to this topic.
So legal ethical principles, typically the internship supervision is the best time. They will get some experience with this, and also learning some of the knowledge part of it as part of their on-campus training, but certainly actual practice, including the internship, is an important place to get this. Maintain appropriate boundaries. The only thing I'd say here is recognize the difference between a boundary crossing and a boundary violation. A boundary crossing is something that occurs but is not harmful to the supervisee, and in fact could be helpful. So like going out to lunch with your supervisee, maybe going and being invited to their wedding and going to their wedding. A boundary violation, as opposed to a boundary crossing, boundary violation is it does cause psychological harm to the supervisee, and that an extreme example is sexual relationships with your supervisee. So when you're thinking about boundaries, which is an ethical issue, avoiding dual relationships, those kinds of things, think about boundary crossing versus boundary violations. And you can read these other ones. These are just, we were going to glance over these anyway. These are some risk management principles and strategies. Again, having a written contract is part of that. You could review this on your own. There's many ethical and legal decision-making models. I'm sure all of you learned them in your on-campus training. We developed an 8-stage model you can take a look at that on your own. But we wanted to give that to you. And then we had some ethics case. This first one was one we were gonna discuss as a group. We weren't going to do it as a breakout, but here the issue is confidentiality. When you read this, Dan, the intern, did not explain the limits of confidentiality to Angela, his client. He also needs to further investigate some of the indications of an eating disorder and issues relating to the depression, and perhaps even consult with the school nurse about it. So those are some of the highlights of that case. These are just some references for issues relating to legal and ethical issues. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. For the state codes, we included Illinois, but of course you have your own. And I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Why don't you move up to slide 101, Mark?
Tell me,
say group goals.
tell me
Keep
when.
going. Right there. Stop with back one.
Back one. Okay.
Okay. So ongoing
is not available at the tone.
ongoing professional development in supervision skills. One of the things that we recommend and have used extensively ourselves is our meta supervision groups. Let me give an example, if I can, if I'm understanding our registrants from Florida International University are possibly a good example of this. If at the beginning of the year, there is an orientation, let's make an internship, to the field experience where the supervisors and supervisees together participate in activities to get the supervisor relationship off on the right foot and learn all the structures that Mark delineated. Then, as the year progresses, an opportunity for supervisors to, using video conference formats, meet with each other, and we advise quarterly as a time frame for that, given how busy we are. But for reflective practices, supervisors, for collegial support, for giving consultation to colleagues, for addressing areas of concern, and exchanging resources for training. And so there are a series of slides there that underline the goals and methods of meta supervision, but it's pretty straightforward. Collegial consultation, even an hour a quarter focused on that developmental stage of a training cycle, can give an opportunity for supervisors to grow in their skills and also support colleagues who might be dealing with difficult situations. Mark, next slide, which is you. Maybe just mentioning the self-reflection survey.
Yeah, just wanted to mention, this is one of your handouts titled the DEP Supervisor Self-Reflection and Supervisor Feedback Survey. It lists all the behavioral markers for the three components of the DEP models, plus some aspects based on the literature of an effective supervisory relationship. And the way you could use this is you would fill it out independently. You'd ask your supervisee to fill it out independently, and then you'd get that feedback and either use it yourself or have a discussion with your supervisee. This is really an indication of how much trust there is. If I get some areas of weakness on that survey from my supervisee, I know I've built trust in the supervisory relationship. If it's all strongly agree, meaning I've done all of it at a high level, I kind of question the veracity of some of the responses. That's the way I approach it. But it's meant for you to fill out for self-reflection, but also your supervisee to fill it out, not on their own supervision, obviously, but what they've experienced with you. And then these are just some other ways to continue to develop your supervision skills. I just wanted to mention very briefly something that Dennis and I and a colleague, Tracy Cruz, have done in Illinois. We've developed a non-practice supervision credential, which is like the NCSP. It's offered by our state association, the Illinois School Psychologists Association, and it involves a 12-hour remote course that they take, plus two meta supervisions, 1 hour supervisions. And currently we have over 300 school psychologists who have completed the credential. And from a university educator standpoint, it's typically, doctoral students get the training and supervised meta supervision experience. Specialist students don't, but the majority of supervision is completed by specialist level school psychologists who, other than their own supervision experiences as a supervisee, don't really have any focused training or meta supervision on their supervision. And so from a university educator point of view, this has really improved the level of supervision. Not that specialist level school psychologists were not effective supervisors, but we think it's really increased their skills in this particular area. What we'd like to suggest to you, if any of you, either school-based practitioners or university educators, are interested in more information about this, we're glad to share from a more thorough description to PowerPoints that are used. So if you're at all interested, think about it, and we're glad to dialogue with you further about it, but we did want to mention it. Dennis?
So the whole next series of slides in your packet are bonus material. They're structured discussion exercises that are designed to fast start an effective supervisory relationship. And we had not intended to go through each one of them, but to leave them as a resource for you. We have used every one of these and have received positive feedback in terms of building the supervisory relationship. Why don't you jump up to 113?
Okay, tell me when to stop.
Keep going.
Or self-care?
No, self-care is another topic that was beyond our scope here, but is of critical importance. One more. So this is the primary resource for this workshop in its second edition. Next slide, Mark. One more before we close with questions. These are additional resources. The bottom text there is one that has some of the case conceptualization models that we use and also incorporate into DEP text. Next slide. So let's take the little time remaining, and I'm happy to stay on longer to take questions, but we want to thank you all for joining us today. Every time you positively influence a supervisor, you are improving the quality of school psychology services. Lindsay, why don't we take a few questions? And as I said, I'm willing to stay on a few minutes longer if people are interested in doing that.
That sounds great. So we do have a question in the chat, a couple of questions, and then I have a question too. And I just wanted to alert all attendees that in the chat, if you haven't been monitoring, there is a link to an evaluation needed to be completed if you are to receive a CEU certificate. It's an attendance certification and a brief evaluation. And I also linked Dennis and Mark's book in the chat if you would like to take a look at it. the first question we have, and Dr. Wells, please tell me if I am misremembering what this is in reference to, but the question is, I am curious as to how we can apply this to individuals that require supervision mentoring for NASP's first NCSP credential renewal.
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. And it's probably something I should mention when I was talking about postgraduate mentorship and the difference between supervision and postgraduate mentorship, which would be for a credentialed school psychologist, as I think the question refers to NASP does require postgraduate mentorship, a year of that, or formal supervision. So some early career school psychologists in districts, for instance, in Iowa, I think it's a state requirement that for the first couple years, they actually have supervision, which includes evaluation and some of the more aspects of supervision that we've talked about. But that postgraduate mentorship agreement that I referred to earlier would apply to the NCSP. So I think in answer to the question, you could really use the more formal supervision if you want to do more evaluation, which you probably don't have that responsibility because the person is already credentialed, or you could use the aspects of the postgraduate mentorship. Does that answer your question?
Hopefully,
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
another attendee is curious to know if the ISPA training is free, even if you don't practice in Illinois.
Dennis, I'll let you answer that one.
It is free for members of the state association. So we have had people take it, but they need to sign up as a member of the Illinois School Psychology Association. I think it's $125, but it's a 14-hour training.
That's great. One question I had for you is if you are a practitioner who is supervising a practicum student or an intern, and perhaps you're newer to the area, or you just don't necessarily have a cohort of others, or even another school psychologist with whom you can bounce ideas off of, do you have ideas for ways to access peers in order to be an effective supervisor?
I think that's where meta supervision groups can come in, and they can be very informal. It could be contacting psychologists in surrounding districts, and Mark, you can speak to this, I think asking the supervisor of the university that your student is at to start something like a meta supervision group with periodic meetings where the topic is what's going on in supervision. Developmentally, is my supervisee where she needs to be or he needs to be? Mark, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything you say. I know we've tried to do that here at ISU. The other thing we've tried to do is set up a listserv for supervisors so people can raise questions. If you belong to the NAS listserv, even the one on supervision, there aren't a lot of supervision questions. It's not really active. So one thought might be to get the intern supervisors who's ever supervising into some kind of listserv. But I'd agree with Dennis. I think the best way is to try to set up some of these meta supervision groups, which we do with the Illinois School Psychology Internship Consortium.
Fantastic. And Dr. Paskowitz just wrote in the chat that there's a Facebook group that folks can also access if you're on Facebook.
Mark, why don't you hit the next slide with our contact information? Any other questions, Lindsay, that you want to throw out there?
I don't think so. I'm just so appreciative of your time. And I also thank all of the attendees for joining us.
Yes, thanks to all of you. We really appreciate it. We wish we had another couple hours for discussion and that, but we know your time is limited. But we do hope we've given you some things that you can really use, and we hope you'll take advantage of those handouts. And if you change them in ways that you think others would be interested in, don't hesitate to share it. And we really appreciate it if you share it with us. We're always looking for feedback. So thank you very much.
And if for some reason you did not get the handout, email us and we'll forward them to you.